Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Human Rights Magazine. In this episode, Mahima Kapur explores the issue of child marriage with a particular focus on the situation in the UK. Child marriage is a problem that primarily affects girls because of their unequal status in society and because of the damaging impacts on their health and overall welfare. In many sub-Saharan countries, many girls younger than 15 are married, especially in parts of Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Mali. In Niger and Chad, more than 70% of girls are married before they are 18 years old. Yet the issue is not confined to specific regions. In the U.S., 20 states do not require any minimum age for marriage with a parental or judicial waiver. Canada and the UK are leaders in opposition to child marriage, yet there are still problems within those countries. Both allow children between the ages of 16 and 18 to marry with parental consent or court approval in the province of Quebec, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation and forced marriage. In many regions of the world where the practice was widespread, there are now laws to restrict or ban the practice. As this podcast was being prepared, the law in the UK was changed to outlaw marriage under the age of 18 in England and Wales. However, as you'll hear, changes to the law are just part of a larger struggle.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Upstream Journal podcast channel Human Rights Magazine. My name is Mahima Kapur and today we are going to be discussing the current situations of early child marriages in the UK. Child marriage is a formal marriage or informal union taking place before one or both of the people involved are 18 years of age. Human rights activists claim that marriages for those under 18 is one of the most hidden forms of violence against women and girls taking place in the UK. According to Girls Not Brides organization, an NGO campaigning to end child marriages, share that 1 in 5 girls around the world are married before they turn 18. So why is it still being continued? According to Ms. Heather Barclay, Director of External Engagements at Girls Not Brides, states the following barriers.
We believe at Girls Not Brides, and the data shows us that the root cause of all child marriage is gender inequality. It happens because girls are considered less valuable than boys, and they're not given the same opportunities as boys, and that is what is underpinning this whole pattern of child marriage. Although some boys do get married under the age of 18, which is still a concern, the overwhelming majority is young girls being married to sometimes older or much. The overwhelming pattern is girls being married to men who may be around their same age or much older, and that tells us the real issue is one of gender inequality. So in order to actually address child marriage, for us, it's not just about stopping that practice. It's also about making sure that all girls can grow up in a gender equal society and have the chance they deserve to decide if and when to marry and how. So for us, that gender inequality is the real underpin. The other issues that come up with child marriage and why it comes, the other drivers, one of them is poverty. We see a lot more child marriage in communities that are poor and in families that are in difficult economic circumstances. Families may find themselves in economic constraints and think the best way to access money is through perhaps securing a bride price or reducing the number of mouths to feed through marrying off a daughter to live in her husband's house. So we know that it happens because of poor economic situations, and we know that when people slip into poverty, child marriage goes up. So the first main reason is gender inequality, and then poverty is layered on top of that. The third reason, which is worth highlighting, is attitudes about girls' sexuality and attitudes about virginity and premarital dating. In a lot of cultures, there's a real sense that girls should not be in contact with boys unless they're married. They shouldn't be dating. And marrying girls young is a way of controlling their sexuality and controlling whether or not they are engaging in other relationships outside of marriage. So what we see is kind of these different issues coming together. It will vary between contexts, But the overall, what we see, child marriage is driven first and foremost by gender inequality, and then layered on top of that, poverty and attitudes around sexuality and virginity. And those three things coming together make the situation a lot worse.
A strong movement to identify and address social norms has developed alongside and within these efforts to address child marriages. Adwa Kwateng Klubitse leads the Partnership and Global Advocacy Program at Forward UK, a British-based African women-led organisation focused on gender equality and upholding rights of African women and girls. She believes that we need to work on replacing the social norms relating to the issues of child marriages.
Whenever you're dealing with issues of social norms and traditions that communities have practiced for so many years, change is difficult. And it's about what you replace those social norms with. So it's not only breaking down the existing social norms, but it's about how you replace those social norms with something else. So if you know that, for example, in a lot of countries, there is a huge stigma attached to premarital sex and a great fear of out-of-wedlock pregnancy, then child marriage is a way of preventing that shame that a daughter may bring on a family by getting pregnant out of marriage. So there's a rush to ensure that that girl is married off before she disgraces the family. There are also economic push factors, because for many of our communities, it goes with a bride price. So if your daughter is found to be chaste, then of course, she's able to attract the bride price that brings wealth to her family. If, on the other hand, she's not, then her value is, and I use the value in inverted commas, is less. Or she may never be married at all because of this. So there's that economic factor. And of course, there are the faith factors that come into play. There's a great deal of religious pressure not to have premarital sex because it's a sin. You know, all of these issues come into play. And that is what makes it difficult sometimes to challenge some of these practices. So, of course, now you've got to put a different value. You've got to enable parents with new ways of parenting that will ensure that their daughters are not engaging in premarital sex or not coming home pregnant out of marriage. So it's easier to marry your daughter off, and I use easier in inverted commas, than to, watch her very carefully and to give her all the values and to deal with all the issues that would otherwise stop her engaging in sex.
According to Ms. Adwa, child early and forced marriages violate girls' human rights, curtails their schooling, harms their health, and sharply constrains their future.
The barriers are huge. The barriers are about, let's start from the beginning. It's about the social norm. It's about provision. For example, if you want to deal with issues about reproductive health, you've got to have adolescent-friendly services. You've got to have comprehensive sexuality education. You've got to have provision. You've got to have an enabling environment. So you've got to have provision for those who fall outside of the social norms. So if you do get pregnant, what are the provisions? How do you go to school? Are there creches? Does the school make provision for you as a child mother to return to education? Mainstream education. If even you've become a child mother and you've weaned your child, can you return to quote unquote state-sponsored normal education? In most cases, no. Particularly among the African communities, there's this view that somehow you will tarnish the other girls who are in the school. And therefore, the child mothers are sort of guided out of mainstream, like I said, into usually substandard vocational kind of education, rather than being able to join mainstream education. And as soon as you do that, you are losing the potential to develop your community, to develop the country's resources, and to build the nation. Because the boys will continue, the fathers of these children will continue in their education, in their careers, uninterrupted. But the girl who's gotten pregnant not only loses the school time, but then you are punishing her further by not giving her the opportunities to carry on in mainstream education and to get the knowledge and skills that will enable her to raise that child out of poverty.
Karma Nirvana is a national honor-based abuse helpline that trains professionals, gather data to inform policies and services, and campaign for change. Ms. Natasha Ratu, the executive director of the organization, shares with us the loopholes that prevent them from providing services to young child marriage victims.
At Karma Nirvana, we had a case fairly recently involving two 15-year-old girls. So we were contacted by police in this case, where two 15-year-old girls went missing. And it transpired that these girls had got married in South Yorkshire in England, and were living now with their husbands and prospective in-laws. And when police wanted to protect and safeguard these girls were actually saying, but we want to marry, and there's huge stigma if we're not married before we're 16. And it left the police with very little opportunity to protect these girls, because we have robust law and forced marriage, but age isn't a standalone factor. So for children, you have to prove that they are experiencing coercion or duress. And here you have these two 15-year-old girls saying, well, we're not being forced to marry. So it didn't meet the threshold for it to be pursued in a prosecution. And ultimately, it meant that professionals were very limited in their ability to safeguard these girls, because when you're 15, 16, you're kind of at the cusp, although you're a child. It's more difficult to protect children at those ages that don't recognize the harms of their own experiences, because they've been conditioned to normalize or legitimize marriage at a very young age. And this is just another reason, really, as to why we have to have real robust law and policy, so that in such a situation, professionals are able to go and use the maximum backing of the law to actually go and protect these girls that don't recognise the harms, because we do globally recognise that child marriage is really harmful and really impacts that young person's prospects in later life.
Karma Nirvana received 80,000 number of calls at their honor-based abuse helpline. She further shares an insight of her observations while providing support to more than 2,000 victims last year.
We have had cases where children will enter the care system and will go into a care placement appropriately because of the honor-based abuse dynamics. And at Karma Nirvana, we've often been involved in cases where judges have asked us to give a perspective about what the risks would be if they were to return back to their family. Now, in some cases, we do have young people that do want to return to their families, because we have to understand that although this is a form of domestic abuse, this is domestic abuse, honor-based abuse, from a person that child has known for their entire life, their parents, and it is really, really difficult to feel, and not many of them do feel, that they are the bad guy, that they are the perpetrator, that they've brought shame. They don't own that actually, their parents are the ones, or their families and communities that enable this are the ones that are in the wrong. So there's a real shift, there's a real paradigm shift in their thinking around who is at odds here. So some of them do want to go back, but it's down to the courts to decide whether actually it would be safe for them to return. And then on the other hand, we have cases where families will seek through the courts to get their children back in the home, but the children have no desire whatsoever to return back. And those cases are slightly more straightforward because the court will listen to the wishes and feelings of the child that's to be protected. So it all really varies, but at 16 you can enter a refuge in England, Wales. However, that isn't always entirely appropriate because if that child doesn't have any sense of independence or any life skills, they may really struggle. So a family setting and a care placement might be more appropriate for them. So every case is very unique and different. It's quite hard to say what the outcomes are. But in our experience, we tend to find that it's not actually the young people themselves that often that ring. It's often the professionals that ring, which to me signals how vitally important it is in terms of the professionals that are the eyes and ears to these issues, that they're getting the responses right and that they're seeing it, because they are often the core referrers into our helpline because they see incidences of this often first. And often, we know that in cases of honour-based abuse, that victims find it more harder to come forward where honour is a dynamic, and often take longer to reach help actually. So it's my understanding from data in England and Wales that it takes them 7 times longer than victims where honour is not a dynamic in their abuse to come forward. So we've got to recognise all of these hurdles that victims of honour-based abuse have to overcome that can take often years. And often it's at that worst possible crisis that they do come forward, which is why in the UK we have a principle called the one chance rule, that you may only have that one chance to get it right. And if you don't get it right, we've seen some cases that have been fatal where people have died as a result of professionals not getting it right or not offering that right support to them at that time when they need it the most. I think that's what we have to appreciate about victims of honour-based abuse, is that it's very likely that this has been an ongoing issue. It's not going to be the first time, like with victims of domestic abuse. We would be encouraging people to ring our national helpline at Calm Nirvana, and it really depends on what their circumstances, because if we're talking about forced marriage, it's really important to distinguish between forced marriage and child marriage, because there is some confusion. Not every child marriage will be a forced marriage technically under our law, because if the child is saying that I want to marry and there is no duress and coercion, because our law doesn't recognise age as a standalone factor, it wouldn't be recognised as a forced marriage. But any marriage under the age of 18 would be a child marriage. So for me, what we would do if it was a child marriage, we would be looking to engage statutory professionals to ensure that we get the right protection and safeguarding responses to protect that person so far as we possibly can. If it was a forced marriage, there's quite a few things that we can do, and depending on their age. So if they were over the age of 16, they could enter a refuge, or potentially they could go into a care placement as well. So we would support them in the process of whichever route was the best route for them. And of course, if they were an adult, they could have access to refuge or safe accommodation. So we would assist in terms of enabling that to happen safely, ensuring that professionals were acting appropriately and uniquely to their individual experience. We could also support them in getting out a forced marriage protection order if it was a forced marriage. And they're really useful if the person perhaps doesn't want to pursue a prosecution with the police, but they still want to have the robust protection from a forced marriage, because that is literally an injunction that will prevent the forced marriage from happening. Or if they've been forced to marry, enable them to get belongings and things like that they might need from that forced marriage scenario. And we would give ongoing support to that person as well at Calm Nirvana. So, whilst we're not a counselling service, we are a listening service. A lot of our call handlers are qualified counsellors and use those skills and listening skills to support them through their processes and experiences that they've been through.
In addition to the poor health outcomes, cessation of girls' education and inability to effectively handle the responsibilities of marriage and motherhood, victims of child marriage are often forced to marry significantly older men. ICRO is a registered charity providing advice and support to Middle Eastern, North African, and Afghan women and girls living in the UK who experienced or are at risk of all forms of honor based abuse. Ms. Sarah Brown, campaign manager at ICRO, shares with us that the spousal age gap reinforces the power dynamics within these marriages and places girls at a greater risk of abuse and exploitation.
It's thought that if a girl marries young, then she can be controlled more easily. And marriage is, if there is a fears about honour, then it's seen as a way of controlling the girl.
In addition to campaigning against child marriages, ICRO launches new Virginity Does Not Define Me campaign to challenge the false and harmful notions that virginity is in any way a measure of girls' or women's worth. The campaign tackles dangerous myths around virginity and calls for a ban of harmful practices of virginity testing, which perpetuate patriarchal and misogynist norms, cause trauma, and can trigger so-called honor-based abuse. Let's now hear from Ms. Sarah about her views of how virginity is related to the issues of child marriages.
Child marriage doesn't happen because children are desperate to get married. Child marriage happens in our experience because of pressures from family or potentially extended family and community members. And we see child marriage as a form of violence against women and girls and a form of honour-based abuse. And in our experiences, the vast majority of child marriages happen because it's upholding that unequal power dynamic between very often a younger girl and an older male. A lot of this is connected to virginity, and we're also now campaigning. We have a campaign called Virginity Does Not Define Me. These things very much interlink. There's often a pressure on girls to be married because there's a concern that if she doesn't marry young, then she perhaps won't be a virgin.
At the moment, 16 and 17-year-olds can marry with the permission of their parents, but various charities have long warned that this loophole makes it too easy for young people to be coerced into marriage. The loophole has remained despite 18 being the age of adulthood in the eyes of the law in UK. The UK government has committed to raise the minimum legal age of marriage to 18 in England and Wales. It is a huge win for campaigners who argue current rules fail to protect girls from abusive, forced marriages. While this would ensure maximum safeguards against all forms of child marriages and sends out the strongest possible message that child marriage is not accepted or tolerated by our government, ICRO is among the other campaigners that argue that it is crucial not only to close the loophole but to make it a criminal offence.
ICRO lead the Safeguard Futures Ban Child Marriage campaign as co-chairs of Girls Not Brides UK, along with 3 other co-chair organisations. And this is something that we've been really focusing on for a long time. And we are absolutely clear in the campaign that we need to make the law fit for purpose to end child marriage. And to do that, we need to understand how child marriages are happening, what kind of child marriages are happening, so we know how to stop them. And we see that there are marriages that are registered, those are under civil law, and we need to stop those. So the way to do that is to end the possibility to register a child marriage. And the government announcement is a commitment to end that. So we really welcome that. So that's a crucial first step. But at the same time, we need to understand that the bigger picture is that there are many, many more marriages which are religious marriages or cultural marriages, which may never be registered, or they may be registered, but unless you change the law to prevent these marriages, then you're not really tackling child marriage as a whole. So we need to change the civil law so you can't register a marriage, but the only way to actually capture all types of marriage is to make child marriage a crime. And we could have an explicit crime of child marriage, or we can update our forced marriage law. So in the UK, since 2014, it's been a crime to force someone to marry. It's not clear enough, and the onus remains on the child to speak out and say, this is happening to me, or this is a forced marriage. Basically, you're not closing the loophole if you just close one part of it, because the other part remains. The issue is that there are different types of child marriage, so it's no good just stopping the registered type of marriage and not other types of marriage. And just one more thing on that, there are people who have had a registered marriage and a cultural marriage or a religious marriage. It's much more common now for these to be separated. And if we only stop the registering of marriages, again, for those individuals, we're not preventing the child marriage from happening. And I think we need to understand that for a child going through child marriage, it's pretty much irrelevant if it's a registered marriage or if it's a cultural or religious marriage. The point is that when the marriage happens, if it's recognized by the people around them, then that's where the expectations of that child marriage begin, and the problems begin for that child.
So that's all we have to cover today on this episode about the current situations of child marriages in the UK. Thank you for your time, and I hope you will take this opportunity to raise awareness about the issues of child marriage on young girls and women in the UK. See you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes. Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes.